Well, hello and welcome to another edition of Rare Classic Cars Porch Chat, if you will. We're getting ready for the some winter storm that's allegedly supposed to dump somewhere around a foot of snow here, which I don't tend to believe the predictions. I think normally they're, uh, well, they shoot high, if you will. But we'll see what happens. In any case, I thought I'd do one more little porch chat here. After the last videos, which a number of you seem to like, there were questions about, how do auto companies get into badge engineering? How did they think that that was going to work? So I wanted to explain a little bit about that, and I'll use GM really to discuss it because they were arguably the biggest proponents of what was called badge engineering at that time. In other words, they took a car that was very similar as a Chevrolet and made it into a Pontiac, an Oldsmobile, Buick, and a Cadillac. So much so that Fortune magazine in 1983 has a cover where they have all these different A cars, the Century 6000, Cutlass Sierra, Celebrity, in a line, all painted like a brownish, reddish color. And the title of the article is "Will Success Spoil General Motors?" Because General Motors, after the early 1980s, 1980, 1981, became quite profitable for a number of years, and then before plunging into near bankruptcy in the early 90s in 1992. But in any case, I thought I'd talk about how that may have come about and why perhaps it made sense at the time to the people who were planning for it. So I've got my wonderful trusty chalkboard here. Some of you complain about my handwriting, and yes, it does suck, but I will try my best to explain. So I've got three factors that we'll discuss: the dealer network, scale benefits, and then also the decreasing share that GM had at the time. So let's talk about the dealer network. So remember, at this time, General Motors dealers were really standalone. There wasn't this cross brand, Pontiac Buick GMC or Buick GMC dealership. Sometimes today you see, especially in Canada, you'll see Chevrolet, Buick, GMC, Cadillac all under one rooftop. That wasn't the case back then. Many, many, many dealers, almost all of them were standalone. So they were a Chevrolet dealer, they were a Pontiac dealer, an Olds, a Buick, or a Cadillac dealer. They didn't have other franchises. And remember also at this time that General Motors is in an environment of decreasing share, from having over 50% of the market, almost I think 55 to 60% in the mid-60s to about 40% at the start of the 80s, and it would go down from there. But they had already lost 15-ish points of share in between the mid-60s and the early 1980s. And so dealers that were selling vehicles as part of, all they had was one brand that they could sell. That was an economic model that worked quite well when GM had very high share. And the problem came when their GM share started going down and less consumers bought products. Dealers with those single brand franchises really started clamoring for more product. Now, one thing to note is, aside from Tesla, dealerships are independently owned and operated franchises. And dealers actually have quite a bit of power over the OEM. So when I was at GM, for instance, the dealers could be a particularly litigious body of companies. And so when if they can litigate and say that you're depriving them of product, and that is your duty as really General Motors to provide them with the ability to earn a good living. And if you don't give them products to do that, then you are unnaturally creating economic harm to them. So in the early 80s, a lot of dealers were basically saying that we need more and more and more models, almost to compensate for the fact that GM's share was eroding. And so GM knew this and also knew the potential legal expenses associated with going to bat with thousands and thousands of dealers and settling cases. And I think that they thought in general that, well, okay, this isn't so bad. We can take a Chevrolet, a Pontiac, a Buick, whatever it is. We could make it into another brand of the car and have it be relatively successful. And after all, it's interesting because this was actually done in a time period, and a lot of people don't discuss it, but one could argue almost that the 1959 General Motors products, you throw out the powertrains were admittedly different across the divisions. But if you look at the sheet metal, the 1959 General Motors lineup, those cars use the same doors, they use the same glass, the side glass, the windshield, the back glass, the roof panel. What they don't share is the hoods and the fenders, and then some of the trunk and the rear quarter panels. But they do share quite a bit of sheet metal. So if you look at some of the 59 cars, like the 59 Pontiac on the sedans as an example, you'll see the fin cuts into the rear door. Well, that is a trim applique on top of a door that's shared across the other vehicles. And I think the 59 Oldsmobile, if you look at it, has an applique on the front door. So there arguably was some, let's say, some rationale behind why this might be able to succeed. After all, let's take the A cars, the Celebrity, the 6000, the Cutlass Sierra, and the Century. They shared doors, glass, roof, and the divisions were able to change the panels in front of and behind the sheet metal. So if you look at those cars, they have what's called a trapped hood, meaning that the hood is surrounded by a fascia in the front. The hood doesn't go all the way over and wrap over the top of the grille. And in the back, you have obviously the trunk, but you have a rear panel as well. And those, what I think GM's rationale was, well, we can allow the divisions to change the front fascia. They'll have to keep the same hood. Now that was different from 59. They'll have to keep the same hood and really the fenders, but they can change the front end of the car. They can change the grille, they can change the headlights, they can change to some degree the bumpers and how that integrates. And on the back, they can change the taillights, they can change the rear bumper, and they can change everything back from the rear quarter panel. You'll see on those A cars, there's like this, it probably is about that long, so call it a foot long of area behind where the rear quarter panel ends in the back, and you've got a similar area in front of the front fender. So it wasn't quite in the spirit of the 1959 cars, because those cars were able to change the entire sheet metal for the hood and the fenders and the quarter panels and the trunk. But it was kind of similar. Again, they could make some changes to styling, but it obviously was more restrictive. When you have a foot of area that you can work with versus the whole front of the car north of the windshield, and a foot in the back versus the entire area from the rear window glass, the trunk, it is more restrictive. But at least I just wanted to give some thought as to why that rationale might have been there, in that, again, one could argue the 59 GM cars were a bit of a harbinger there for what was coming later with the brand engineering. But that gets to the second issue, which is scale benefits. So I've drawn here a little graph in my best penmanship, and imagine that on this vertical axis is the cost per unit, and on this horizontal axis is the number of units you produce. Well, as the number of units produced decreases, the cost per unit goes up, and it goes up very, very fast. And likewise, if you increase the number of units that you're producing, the cost per unit comes down. Well, this was not lost on General Motors. And by the way, you can see you get to a point at some point here where there's what a fancy term for this would be is diminishing marginal returns. In other words, the cost really doesn't change much as the number of units increases. But in this region, if you change the number of units, the cost really does increase or decrease rapidly. So that cost curve is very steep, particularly for chassis and body components, the sheet metal of the car and the underbody of the car. And you need to have a lot of scale in order to get good costs. So this was not lost on GM, and consequently, again, let's take those A cars. The A cars share chassis, and they share all the sheet metal, basically. And what the designers could touch were the areas in front of the fenders, behind the quarter panels, more of the front fascia-ish area, if you will, the interiors, and that was really what's different on those cars. If you sit in any of those A cars, you'll notice that the interiors of them are very, very different across the Celebrity 6000, Sierra, and Century. But the roof lines, the window glass, the doors, etc., are the same. Well, remember, GM at this point knew that it had about a $2,000 per car cost differential versus the Japanese. And that's could be the subject of a whole nother video on why that arose. It's a number of factors, from foreign exchange to labor costs to pension obligations to scale issues and fixed cost structure. There's a lot of reasons. It's not, some people will say, oh, it's the greedy union. No, it's many factors. But let's just take the fact that GM knew that it had a $2,000 per car cost differential. Well, how are you going to help mitigate that? What are you going to do? Well, given this curve, you need to generate more scale. And you need to generate it on the products that require the most scale in order to find yourself in this portion of the curve where the cost per unit is not changing much for the number of units you produce. That means that you have to share chassis and you have to share body components, particularly stamped components. Have you ever seen a stamping facility? Big stamping presses and the dies that are used to make sheet metal, you want those running continuously. You don't want to be stopping to change the dies to make new sheet metal, because at the time, although it's not true today, at the time it could take in some cases a day to change over the sheet metal dies from one particular set of sheet metal that you were making to another. Now it's gotten down to hours or even less. But back then it took many hours to change the sheet metal over. And so you wanted to use common sheet metal so you could run the presses all the time and you wouldn't have to switch it, and that would help you generate cost savings. So again, GM knew that they had to start closing this gap in the cost differential. And one of the ways they did it, for better or worse, was to have those cars share a lot of sheet metal. And they thought perhaps that they could get away with the front and rear being a bit different, and that the customer perceiving the car to be different, with the marketing to be different, with the interior feel to be different. And truth be told, it just wasn't enough. But remember, the dealer body really was also telling them that they needed that. Because if I were a Chevrolet dealer and I saw a car that Pontiac or Buick or Oldsmobile had, I wanted it as well. And if you didn't give it to me, you were impinging upon my ability to make a profit. So hence you get things even later, like the Pontiac Torrent and the Chevrolet Equinox, the Pontiac T1000 and the Chevette. So you get quite a few of these Me Too cars, I guess you can call them, that the dealer body wanted. And then third, I've talked about a little bit, but this decreasing share. You have all this going on in an environment of decreasing share, which is going to push you up the cost curve, meaning that if you're not selling as many units as you once were, your cost per unit's naturally going up. So what can you do if you're in a decreasing share environment to get back down the cost curve? You got to share more components. It's the only way you can do it. So it's a bit of a flywheel. When things are going well and when your market share is good, you're able to differentiate more because you have more scale benefits, because you're selling more units. That leads to potentially more marketing differentiation and even more sales. But the inverse also happens. You start decreasing share, you can't spend as much on differentiation, therefore you produce products that are similar in the market and your sales maybe drop even more. This is an issue, and by the way, as you're also decreasing share, all of your suppliers that you work with are going to charge you more as well, because you're not the number one player in the marketplace, so you don't have the same volume that you once did. So it becomes harder and harder on the way down to deliver a product for the same amount of cost. And this is true not just in the auto industry, but any industry. So the companies with the largest scale benefits are really able to command more and more share. And I guess for better or worse, you see that in the marketplace today. Think about the concentration that you have right now in the Amazons of the world, the Apples, Facebook, Microsoft, Walmart, Costco. You didn't have these mega stores or conglomerate companies in the past. Yes, you did have industrial conglomerates like GE and General Motors, ITT, etc. And the philosophy there was that they wanted to pool all of these resources together to get scale. But today you have it where a particular company like Walmart, they have scale not because they're diversified, they're a retailer. They just own retail in so many different places and are so large that they can command so much buying power with their vendors that, a Walmart is down here on the cost curve in terms of the cost per unit. A mom and pop store is somewhere up here. And it's unfortunate, but that's kind of where we are. So I hope that that gives you at least some rationale into how did brand, these brand management, or, we'll call it the proliferation of various models happen. And obviously it didn't pan out as GM had hoped, but at the same time, what are you going to do? Your dealer body is clamoring for more cars. You have a cost per unit differential versus the competitors already. Your share is decreasing, so your cost differential is going to get worse. How do you solve that? I think they thought the most rational way was trying to get more scale out of those components that I mentioned, and that means sharing more parts. And you can imagine that creates issues for the design team. Imagine if you're a designer and you're told, okay, you get to design a new car, but you got to share the same doors, glass, roof, hood, trunk as the other divisions. Go at it. You get to basically fix the front end sheet metal in the trunk. And you can do the interior. How are you going to feel as an exterior designer or somebody who's trying to design a new exterior? Somebody just put a bunch of constraints upon your creative thought process that you can't do anything about. How do you make a car look different? It's got to share all of those common components. It's very, very difficult. And you get kind of the things that we saw, even to the point that Lincoln pigeonholed the C bodies, the DeVille, the Electra, the Olds 98, in an ad for the Lincoln Town Car in the late 80s, where somebody is looking for their Cadillac at a valet, and they tell the person, I need my Cadillac, and the person brings a Buick. And then somebody else comes out of the restaurant and says, no, that's my Buick. No, that's my Cadillac. And then there's a whole parking lot scene of people arguing like, no, that's the Cadillac. No, that's the Buick. No, that's the Oldsmobile. And then, of course, the guy comes up and tells the valet he wants the Lincoln Town Car, and they pull up the Town Car right away because it looks so different from everything. So I hope that was helpful insight for you. Let me know if you like it and other topics that you'd like me to address. And I can go into any of these in more detail. I'm just trying to make some brief segments on them. Stay warm, everybody. Take care.